Hey everyone, it's John here from Hockey, back with another video, and this video is going to be the most underrated NHL player from every team. So all 31 teams, we're going to go through it. So if you are here and you're new to the channel, welcome if you're a new subscriber. Smash that like button and leave your thoughts in the comment section below. If you disagree with one of my picks, let me know, and hey, I hope to see you more on the channel. So let's get right into it, starting with Anaheim, and I believe Danton Heinen and Sonny Milano are two players, in my opinion, that are very underrated. Both players that just came over to Anaheim. I think for Danton Heinen, he has had very underrated 5-on-5 numbers, and I do think he's one of those players that is not seen as a top six forward, but is right there, middle of the lineup kind of guy. Same thing with Sonny Milano. He came over, scored a couple goals, so I do think those guys are pretty underrated in Anaheim. Connor Garland. This is a guy that, a 20-goal scorer for the first time in a couple seasons for the Arizona Coyotes. I think Connor Garland is very underrated. He's been playing very well with Taylor Hall. I do think some people have given the reason that, he plays with better players. He's been given that opportunity, but this is a guy that works hard. He was never highly touted. He was never a guy that had these huge expectations, but he worked his way through the AHL, and now he's a top six forward in the NHL and definitely doesn't get recognized enough. Okay, so this is a guy that I feel like doesn't get, I would say, recognized as a top forward defenseman enough by other teams. Again, when we go over these underrated players, this is more by other fan bases and everyone outside of the fan base that this player's on. So for the Boston Bruins and their fans, they know Brandon Carlo is, if not a top pairing defenseman, a top four defenseman. Again, he's not going to bring you this ton of offense, but in terms of defensive play, Brandon Carlo is one of the best in terms of strictly defense. He's not worried about the offensive side of things. He'll throw a shot on net, he'll pinch in, but for the most part, he's very solid on the defensive side of things, and I don't think a lot of people outside of the Boston Bruins recognize that. Okay, so the Buffalo Sabres have a couple. I think Henry Jokiharju is very underrated, but if I'm looking at Dominic Cahoon, who they just acquired from the Penguins, this is a guy that I feel like could still be a top six forward. He's still young enough. He came over to the NHL with the Blackhawks, had a very good first season, got traded to the Penguins, and I think the Penguins didn't really appreciate him enough. I don't think they gave him enough of an opportunity. So he came over to Buffalo. He only played a few games, but I think Sabres fans saw right away that he could be a special player for them next year. Now for the Calgary Flames, Andrew Mangiapane. I think for Mangiapane, he plays with Tkachuk. He's been given that opportunity. I call him the Italian Stallion. He's one of those guys, he's very overlooked, but when he's given that opportunity, he works hard. He gets in those areas. He's a smaller player, but I do think Mangiapane is very underrated outside of Calgary. So for the Carolina Hurricanes, I think they've got a few players that are very underrated. I think Teuvo Teravainen is very underrated. I think Jacob Slavin is very underrated. But I wanted to look at Warren Foegele because Warren Foegele last year was playing so good in the playoffs. He came out of nowhere, wasn't putting up production in the season, then came out of nowhere. And this season, we're talking about, I think he's in around 30 points in like 68 games. So this is a guy that now he's shown that he has the capability of moving up and down the lineup. He's one of those work hard, very simple kind of players, gets the job done, but I do think he's very overlooked, and I think towards the end of the season he was on the fourth line, but then again, he could jump into the lineup and make an impact, and I think we could possibly see that again in the playoffs. Chicago Blackhawks. So I think Calvin DeHaan's a very underrated player. I've talked to Blackhawks fans, just a very defensive, reliable guy. When he went down with injury, the Blackhawks suffered defensively, and I do think that proves that DeHaan was one of their more, if not most, reliable defensemen this year. And I think DeHaan, we've seen him with the Islanders, we've seen him with the Carolina Hurricanes. So I think Calvin DeHaan is a very solid but underrated defenseman. Okay, so for the Colorado Avalanche, I think there's a few again. I think Donskoy is very underrated. I think Burakovsky is very underrated. But I wanted to go with Samuel Girard. I think Girard is very overlooked and very underrated, especially this season. All eyes were on Cale Makar, and there's other guys on that Avalanche defense. People are forgetting about Samuel Girard. He really didn't get that opportunity on the top power play unit. When Makar went down with injury, Girard was stepping up. So I do think people need to realize Girard is this very good player. I know people in Colorado, Avalanche fans, know how good he is. Columbus Blue Jackets, I'm going to go with Oliver Bjorkstrand. I think there's a couple other players as well, but Bjorkstrand, it's one of those things, he's battled with injuries, but when he's in the lineup, he's an impact player, and I do think he's very underrated. Dallas Stars. So I think Denis Gurianov is one of the most underrated young players in the league. Speed. This guy is absolutely disgusting. So good. I think there's a couple other guys that are underrated. Rope Hintz is very underrated on that team, but I do think if you're looking outside, I don't think many people talk about Denis Gurianov, so I think he needs the recognition. The Detroit Red Wings, I would go Jonathan Bernier. Maybe this is a bit of a hot take, but Bernier was the MVP for the Red Wings season, in my opinion, and I think with a better defense, Bernier would have had a much better year. I think for Jonathan Bernier, people have always thought of him as like a backup or just like a fringe starter, but this year he showed that he could potentially be a very good starter. Again, this is not something that where he's young and he's going to have this potential. He's older now. Bernier might get an opportunity. He's got 1 year left on that contract, but I do think he's very underrated. Okay, so for the Edmonton Oilers, this one was a little bit tough, but I think Klefbom is one of the more underrated defensemen. I think the fact that the Oilers had the number 1 power play unit, the second best penalty kill unit, and Klefbom was part of both those units. This guy doesn't get it appreciated enough. I mean, in Edmonton in general, but I don't think he gets recognized outside of that as well. Florida Panthers, so I could go Jonathan Huberdeau here, but I feel like this season a lot more people have started to recognize him, so I would decide to go Frank Vatrano. And while he has played with good players this season, I do think he's been underrated. He was a very sneaky player in Boston, and he's played very well with Florida. Okay, so this one's interesting. I think LA doesn't really have a whole lot of options to go by. They've been a team that struggled and a lot of new faces. But I think Alex Iafallo has been a very underrated player over his career so far. He just really hasn't been with a good team yet. Like, he came onto the scene after the LA Kings basically run. Minnesota Wild, I think Jared Spurgeon somehow is still underrated. I mean, he's been underrated in my opinion for the last couple seasons. He was probably a top 15, top 20 defenseman this year. Montreal Canadiens, I'm going to go with Brendan Gallagher. I think, yeah, there's been some injuries with Gallagher as well, concussion. I think for Gallagher, he's very sneaky. He works hard. He gets into the gritty areas. Ryan Ellis for the Nashville Predators. I think for Ellis, if you look at Matthias Ekholm, if you look at Roman Josi, he's probably the third guy in terms of appreciation, in terms of recognition outside of that Preds team. I think Ryan Ellis is a very solid defenseman. All three of those guys have very good contracts. Now for the New Jersey Devils, I think Mackenzie Blackwood. Honestly, I think he could be in the Calder conversation. He had a very underrated year. I think he was one of the more underrated goalies of this season. If you look at the defense, they're not working with a whole lot. All right, so the New York Islanders, I'm going with Adam Pelech. Islanders fans know how much this guy has progressed. I've talked to Islanders fans. This guy is very underrated outside of the Islanders. I have people always going, who's Adam Pelech? Like, that's how underrated this guy is, and he's become a very solid defenseman, like a guy that can step into the top 4. So for the New York Rangers, Ryan Lindgren. I could go Adam Fox here. Fox, I still think, is underrated by a lot of people. I could go Mika Zibanejad, but I feel like Zibanejad was more underrated at the start of the season. After that 5-goal game, I think a lot more people recognized how much of an impact he was having in New York outside of Panarin. But I think Ryan Lindgren's a guy that I feel like he's only 22 years old. He's going to have an impact with the Rangers for years to come. I mean, that top 4 for the Rangers is going to be great. All right, Ottawa Senators, I'm going with Connor Brown. I think there's a couple guys you can go here. This year, he was playing top line minutes at some point, so I think Connor Brown is definitely underrated. Philadelphia Flyers, so I could go 2 routes here. Sean Couturier, for me, has gotten a lot more recognition this year, but I still think he's underrated by a lot of people. I think he should be a Selke candidate, if not the favorite. Only other guy I might go towards, I mean, some people will say a guy like, I think Scott Lawton's pretty underrated. I think a guy like Travis Konechny was just recognized this year now with this crazy year he's having. But I would look at Ivan Provorov, because I think Provorov's been easily a top 20 defenseman this year, and a lot of people don't see it that way. So I think Provorov, for me, might be the most underrated player for the Philadelphia Flyers. Pittsburgh Penguins, I'm going to go Jared McCann, a very solid third liner at least. I mean, he can play the wing, he can play out the middle. I think McCann is just going to keep getting better. He's young enough where he's jumping into his prime, and he's going to keep improving. San Jose Sharks, I'm going to go with Tomas Hertl. I think with the San Jose Sharks, a lot of them underperformed this year. I think it's very similar to the way the Preds forward group kind of performed this season. So I'm going to go Tomas Hertl because he was actually playing well until his injury. I think he was like that one guy. I mean, Couture was having a good season as well, but I think everyone kind of recognizes Couture as the guy now in San Jose, where Tomas Hertl, I think, is still underrated. And even looking at the playoffs last year, and still not enough people are talking about him. St. Louis Blues, I'm going to go Vince Dunn. I think for Vince Dunn, if you look at that St. Louis Blues defense core, Parayko, Pietrangelo, Justin Falk, those guys are more bigger names than Vince Dunn, and Vince Dunn is still younger going to his prime. I think another guy that's very underrated this year was David Perron. He had an insane season, and again, outside of him, there's just so many other bigger names on that forward group. Tampa Bay Lightning, I think it's easily Anthony Cirelli. This guy had such an insane season. I don't think people were talking about him until the last stretch of the season. He's definitely maybe top 5, top 6 in Selke candidates, and that's crazy to say. Anthony Cirelli, he just came out of the scene, but he was on that top line after Stamkos got injured. This guy was making noise, and he was playing insane on both sides of the ice. Toronto Maple Leafs, so I could go 2 routes here. A lot of people would say William Nylander. I think that's the easy answer. I think Nylander obviously got more recognition towards the second half. He had a really bad season last year, really bad playoff last year. I think for Zach Hyman, he's also very underrated, and I would maybe argue he's the most underrated at this point. And this point in 2020, now that Nylander is getting more recognition, he's succeeding. I think Hyman, his hard work, his ethic, what he does. I mean, I'm looking back at 2018, the goal in Game 5 against the Boston Bruins. Like he does those things sometimes where he explodes, he drives the net, he causes havoc. So for the Vancouver Canucks, JT Miller, I think Miller is still very underrated. Again, I think he was underrated going into the season. I think he's getting recognized more now. I think Vancouver Canucks fans have to vouch for him because some people still don't realize that JT Miller was like one of the best. I mean, him and Pettersson were the two best players arguably this season for the Canucks. Jacob Markstrom, I think, was the MVP, but in terms of skaters, those two guys were electric. Quinn Hughes obviously on the back end, but JT Miller, very underrated on this team. I think for a guy like Jake Virtanen, we'll see what he can do into the playoffs. He struggled a bit, but in terms of underrated and a success story this year, that would be JT Miller. Vegas Golden Knights, I think this was really easy for me. I think Mark Stone is still underrated by a lot of people, but I got to go Shea Theodore because for me, Shea Theodore is a top 20 defenseman. This year, he put a big mark for me. I mean, that Vegas Golden Knights defense is not good. Outside of Theodore, like, that's why they acquired Martinez. Anyone that questions, like, oh, they have some guys, like, no, that's why they acquired Alec Martinez. Like, Shea Theodore needed help. If you're looking at Shea Theodore, that top defenseman for Vegas, I think he's a top 20 defenseman easily, at least for this year, and very underrated around the league. Jakub Vrana is probably the most underrated on this team. I think there's a couple guys, but Vrana has come into the scene, been a very consistent top 6 forward, and I think Vrana has a very bright future. And finally, for the Winnipeg Jets, I think Kyle Connor is arguably the most underrated. I think Nikolai Ehlers is very underrated as well. A guy like Neil Pionk, who stepped on the scene and actually had a very good year. I think there's a couple underrated guys here, but I will go with Kyle Connor because I think he's not recognized enough as like a legit premier scorer in this league. And he is that, and he should be more recognized, but he's very underrated throughout. So thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts. Again, please subscribe if you are new. If you're watching, I hope to see you more. Smash that like button. And yeah, I hope to see you around on the channel more. This was John from Hot Take Hockey. Have a good one. Peace out.